Brand new research study that we conducted, and we're going to share it with you in two parts. Part number one is going to be perceptions and usage of podcasting within the broader podcast universe. And part two of our presentation today is going to take a deep dive into those who are specifically using YouTube for their podcasts. So we can really start to understand the whats and the hows and even some of the whys of behavior so that you can get a feel for this audience and formulate some strategy. My name is Jaynachlis. I'm a consultant at Coleman Insights. We're a media research firm. We've been around for 45 years. I've been there for 6 of the 45, and we're audio specialists. So we primarily work with clients in the podcasting, radio, and streaming industries.
And I'm Steve Goldstein. I run a consultancy called Amplify Media. We are strategic audio advisors. We work with brands, we work with companies, we work with podcasters. We are Pan Audio, and we have been around since VS, before Serial. And I'm also an adjunct professor at NYU teaching a course called The Business of Podcasting. It is the first course at a major university to cover that. So before we hit the data, I thought we would sort of set the stage a little bit here. I want to set the scene. I think podcasting falls into 3 major eras. The first era is the MeUndies era. That is the era of baked-in ads, endorsements. How many of you have over 3 mattresses that you've purchased? Public radio was part of that very early in the podcasting. Serial, of course, at that point. And really important was the native app in Apple Podcasts. When that became native, distribution increased dramatically. So that's the MeUndies era. Then we moved to the second era, which started 4 or 5 years ago, and that would be the throw spaghetti against the wall era. And that is all about ad tech coming in, doing ad insertion, big companies intrigued and spending to build the capacity to develop and promote podcasts. I think of that era very much like what we've seen with streaming TV, like Netflix or Disney Plus. It's about garnering audience. And a lot of this has been great content. A lot of it, frankly, has been miserable. But that's the spaghetti against the wall part of it. Another part of that, though, is distribution. And those are apps. And apps are a tricky and tough business. On this stage, the main stage at Podcast Movement in Nashville, which I think was 2 years ago, how many of you saw Mark Cuban introduce Fireside? Now, Mark Cuban's never the dumbest guy in the room. We don't hear much about Fireside anymore. Remember Facebook? Facebook podcasts. It lasted 13 months before they realized this is hard. How about Twitter podcasts? Remember Twitter podcasts? Remember Twitter? Clearly, not so easy. All right, so the graveyard is loaded with podcast apps. Sad to see Stitcher be the last or the latest, but there probably will be more. And that's because distribution has become a real tough game, and we're going to show you some of that data today. And it's brought on by the ascension of YouTube. It's different. There's no RSS feed, not today. There probably will be. There's a lot of chatter about that, but not today. And that creates a lot of vexing issues and concern for everybody here. Totally legitimate and understandable. It's also the second largest search engine in the world, right behind its own sister, Google. 3.7 million videos are uploaded every day. 500 hours every minute of content. Pretty massive. So how are we going to get our stuff to surface there? That's pretty tricky. Here's what we do, though. It doesn't matter which research study you're looking at. Now, it clearly shows YouTube as the #1 podcast app. Edison Research, Signal Hill Insights, all says the same thing. You're going to see affirmation of that here, but we've gone deeper, and we're going to sort of pull through some other things to give you some ideas, some insights, how to master all of this, knowing that it's still evolving.
position. So, to get into this research study, you had to say that you have consumed a podcast in the past month. And I want to draw your attention for a second to that word consumed. So you might be saying to yourself, it's kind of weird, why don't you say listen? We use the word consume very deliberately and intentionally because, as you're going to see as we get into it a little bit, we're going to talk about listening and watching. And we didn't want to bias the sample in any way. So very much in the beginning of this survey, we use the word consume. So when you see consume and consumption, that's the reason for it. We wanted a really big sample, a big representative sample. So this is 1,000 people we talked to that consume podcasts in the United States. They're as young as 15 and they're as old as 64, a really broad age range. And we have quotas in place for age, gender, ethnicity, and region based on the population. So the big headline here, the definition of a podcast is changing. It's big time, and everybody has different perceptions of what a podcast is, including all of you in this room. And frankly, perception for you of what a podcast is probably defined a little bit by your origin story. In other words, if you started listening to a podcast on Apple years ago, you might be more likely to say that it's audio only. Whereas if you started consuming Smartless on YouTube 6 months ago, you might be more likely to not say that it's audio only. So with all of this question, is it audio? Is it video? We simply ask this question, how would you define a podcast? No matter what we think or you think, this is what consumers across the United States think. Their choices were audio or video, audio only, or video only. And 75% of podcast consumers in the United States say a podcast should be defined as audio or video. 22% said a podcast is audio only, and 3% said video only. Now, we were curious about this and how it was perhaps influenced by what you're using for your podcasts. So we took a look at this among users of some different platforms. Were users of YouTube kind of goosing this number? Well, here's what you just saw on the last slide. 75% of all podcast consumers say that it could be audio or video. And if you prefer YouTube, meaning you use YouTube the most as your platform for podcasts, you are a little bit more likely to say audio and video. But guess what? If you prefer Spotify and you prefer Apple, you still say that it's audio or video, more than 2/3 of them. So this is a broadly, widely held view among podcast consumers. So now you know how people define a podcast today. So how are they consuming their favorite podcasts? And again, you're going to see a remarkable shift in behavior. They first started consuming their favorite podcast and how they're consuming it today with the 3 different choices that you saw. Now look at what they said and how they consumed podcasts when they first started consuming them. More than half said audio only. Now look at it today. More people are consuming podcasts via audio and video than audio only. Now, I will direct your attention to the 39%. 4 out of 10 people are still consuming their favorite podcast via audio only. That's not an insignificant number. If you think that people are tethered to one podcast app, well, this slide should lay waste to that theory, because 72% of podcast consumers are using multiple apps for consumption. So what are they using? Here's the question. Which services, apps, or destinations are you currently using for podcasts? They can answer as many as they wanted. This is among all respondents. Steve talked about this in the beginning. YouTube is number 1, the number 1 podcast app, followed closely by Spotify at 53%, Apple at 30%. Take a look at the next to last one, but it's in the top 10 already. Now we asked very specifically in this questionnaire, when we say YouTube Music, we made it clear that it's a different app than YouTube. And as you might know, YouTube Music only got in the podcast game a few months ago. But already, 13% are reporting using YouTube Music for podcasts. That is a big number at an early stage and something to keep our eye on. So now you know what they use. So this one, they had to choose one. Which service, app, or destination are you using most for podcasts? You saw these big three at the top of the graph on the last slide, right? YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. There are a lot of podcast apps available, but 73% of podcast consumers prefer one of these three. So we'll call them the big three. Tons of other apps, some very, very big brands that you see on here, but that other 27% is spread across the rest of the universe. Now, which app you use, or destination you use for podcasts, is in part defined by how old you are. And this finding, frankly, surprised us a little bit, and it may surprise you. So we asked which services, apps, or destinations you currently use for podcasts. If you are over the age of 25, you are more likely to use YouTube for podcasts. If you are under the age of 25, you are more likely to use Spotify for podcasts. Now we get into podcast frequency. How often do you consume podcasts? You may have seen a chart like this before. 40% of consumers in our sample said that they listen to podcasts on a daily basis. 49% of those podcast consumers say weekly, and 11% monthly. But another piece of feedback that we get from clients, that we've heard from companies, is, okay, yeah, but YouTube and getting in that game, I think YouTube consumers aren't as engaged. And I don't think that they're really using podcasts as often as people on other platforms. So let's find out. How often do you consume podcasts? That's on the left, what you just saw, with 40% daily. Now look at it among those who use Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And what you're going to notice here with the one on the right is YouTube podcast consumers are essentially using podcasts at about the same level as everybody else. It looks the same. So there's no significant difference in podcast consumption frequency between YouTube users and users of the other big two platforms.
Is there anybody from Spotify in the room? Take a look at this. I use Spotify a lot, but what they're saying here is it's easier or more enjoyable to use YouTube than it is Spotify. And which one makes better podcast recommendations? Also surprised us, 62% say Spotify. So now, let's look at Apple. It's the same questions, it stacks just a little bit differently, easier to use, 76% for YouTube over Apple, more enjoyable, 71%. I mean, it's a runaway. These are YouTube podcast users. This is not the full survey. Obviously, that wouldn't make sense here. So it's people who are satisfied with YouTube, extremely satisfied. All right, so let's roll into some of our findings and some recommendations. Number one, the definition of a podcast has changed.
And this is a really, really big one. And this should be considered. Remember, first of all, that the definition of a podcast changing is among everybody. This wasn't just YouTube people. It's Spotify people. It's Apple people. Everybody, most people in this universe believe that it's changed. And so it's maybe time also to think about our language, right? And should we always be saying listening to a podcast, or we should start folding in listen to or watch?
YouTube is the #1 app for podcasts. Again, this is clear at this point. So you're going to have to come up with a strategy to deal with YouTube if you want to be successful. And yes, as I said at the beginning, vexing, not easy, but it has to be done.
YouTube for podcasts is not just younger demos. You saw that split that you thought was pretty amazing. You were actually more likely to use YouTube for podcasts if you were over the age of 25. YouTube is a monster. It's got videos of all kinds, and it's attracting all demos. So don't think that you're just reaching younger demos with YouTube in your podcasting efforts.
4 out of 10 podcast consumers prefer audio only. That goes back to the big stuff, okay? The full 1,000 sample. That's a big number, and as it should be. Audio is native to podcasting. You'll figure out whether you have a video application for podcasting, but a lot of people do this. I mean, just sample of one, my 25-year-old uses YouTube for podcasts, but it's not that he's watching the videos all the time. He may go and look at what a guest looks like or the host looks like, but sometimes he's walking, sometimes, he's cooking and he doesn't have time to look at the video, but that's all part of consumption.
And podcast consumers are not just using one app. So think about the fact that if they're using multiple platforms, and not every platform is the same, as we're going to get into, this requires some different thinking strategically.
Big finding. 1 out of 4 YouTube podcast consumers can't find their favorite podcast there. So I just covered that, but that's important to know.
And finally, 40% of YouTube podcast consumers discover a new podcast on Shorts. We actually just had a conversation with someone yesterday and talked to them about their marketing efforts. And they've got teaser components, just like you just saw with Smartless, but they're on Instagram Reels and Facebook, but was not using YouTube Shorts. So you see that YouTube Shorts is a really big opportunity for marketing.
All right, so let's get this thing down. It'll change tomorrow, but these are good for today. Create a bespoke strategy for each podcast platform. You were already doing that. Your strategy on Spotify was different than your strategy on Apple because you had to work the system. And now you have a third one that you need to work. That is not a surprising outcome right now.
I think it's pretty clear from this study that you shouldn't ignore YouTube. Harnessing the power of their reach is just a massive audience development opportunity. You're going to have to decide how to use YouTube specifically to deliver your podcast, but everybody should be thinking of it as a marketing opportunity. And if you're on a different platform than YouTube, and you're saying everywhere you get your podcasts, and you're not specifically saying YouTube, if you're on YouTube, that might be a missed opportunity.
I think it's federal law, though, that we have to say everywhere you get your podcast.
TM.
Yes. So there may be some legislation that might fix that. Okay, optimize for YouTube. Again, different monster. You're competing against all content, video, audio, not just podcast content. And you probably don't have the budget or the wherewithal or the creativity to be Steven Spielberg. But there are many successful podcasts on YouTube today, and the number is growing, that have figured out the visual component that's cost effective and that's working for them. Really key, we talk to a lot of people who have their podcasts up on YouTube, and we also talk to a lot of people who are just experts in YouTube. And these are a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, by the way, YouTube published a 67-page podcast handbook. Hard to get through, but all this stuff is in there. Keywords and consistency, titles, descriptions, categories, and tags. Learn how to work the system. Focus on your channel. That's something that is really important in YouTube because that's where the algorithm starts.
And put your shorts on. It's a marketing opportunity. 40% of consumers using YouTube for podcasts discovered a new podcast in YouTube Shorts. There are 50 billion views globally of YouTube Shorts every single day. Now, you may not use this tool. There are other tools available. There's obviously going to be more tools coming. There'll be AI tools. But Shorts does have a clipping tool. They're trying to make it as easy as possible for you to take pieces of your podcast and put pieces on Shorts to promote it.
And we have no idea if it's any good or anything. It's not that we've tried. The point is, they're trying to make it easy for us. Determine the role of video for your podcast. So, there are narrative podcasts. There are interview podcasts. They're very different monsters, and what you do with them can be very different on YouTube. You need to figure out what's right for your situation, and maybe you do make changes over time. I think it's a science project. It's going to take some time and effort. And as I mentioned on the algorithm, It takes time to warm up the algorithm. And that's why many podcasters have been frustrated with YouTube. It's not working for us. You got to do the hygiene.
Earlier, the rules today may not be the rules in a week from now. It's constantly changing. And the other thing is be patient. There's a lot of people trying YouTube, and there's a lot of people getting frustrated with YouTube because they might not be seeing results as fast as they want. So be patient and stick with it.
So for those that aren't here, that are traveling, the people that you work with, there is going to be a webinar.
Yep, so that webinar is coming up on Thursday, September 7th at 2 o'clock. You can register for that at ColemanInsights.com and AmplifyMedia.com, and we will release a copy of the deck that you just saw today from the presentation immediately following the webinar. Also, we're going to release some additional study findings. We couldn't possibly show you every single thing in today's presentation, and some of those things include podcast ad consumption, the appeal of different types of video, YouTube podcast consumption. We also have more videos. We were only able to show.
I write a blog on podcasting, which is pretty well circulated around the world, kind of rewarding. It is at amplifymedia.com.
Yep, and connect with us on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, and that clock day is at 0.
Right on time. Let's go. Thank you, everybody.